He told his students to laugh at her, to treat her like a warm-up, like she didn't belong there. But he had no idea. He had just placed his best fighter on the mat with someone who had already mastered everything he was about to teach. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you believe respect should never be judged by appearances, make sure to like and subscribe, because stories like this remind us how quickly the world can shift. Now back to Emily Carter. The late afternoon light stretched across the polished mats of Iron Core Jiu-Jitsu Academy, casting long shadows from the tall windows that lined the far wall, and the air carried that familiar mix of discipline and ego, where every movement was measured and every glance quietly evaluated who belonged and who didn't. The door opened with a soft push, and Emily Carter stepped inside, her sneakers worn, her hoodie plain, her presence almost too quiet for a place that thrived on dominance and display. And for a moment, no one noticed her, which was exactly how she seemed to prefer it. She paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room not like a beginner overwhelmed by a new environment, but like someone cataloging patterns, distances, rhythms, her eyes steady, her posture relaxed, her breathing even, as if she had done this 1,000 times before, though nothing about her appearance suggested she had. A few students glanced over, then looked again, slower this time, their expressions shifting from curiosity to amusement, and then the first chuckle broke the silence, low and dismissive, followed by another, until the energy in the room subtly tilted. "You here for the yoga class?" One of them called out, not loudly enough to be outright confrontational, but just enough for others to hear, and a ripple of laughter followed, light, casual, but sharp enough to land. At the center of the mat stood Brad Hoffman, the head instructor, arms crossed over his chest, his presence commanding without effort, a man who had built his reputation on control and certainty, and beside him, Jason Miller, his top student, stretching with the easy confidence of someone used to being the best in the room. Brad's eyes moved to Emily, taking in her clothes, her age, the way she stood without urgency, and something in his expression shifted into that familiar calculation, the one that sorted people into categories within seconds. "This isn't a beginner fitness class," he said, his voice calm but edged with condescension, the kind that didn't need to be loud to carry weight, and a few students smirked, already anticipating what kind of show this might become. Emily didn't respond immediately, didn't defend herself, didn't explain. She simply walked forward, step by step across the mat, her shoes now set neatly by the edge, her movements unhurried, deliberate, as if the room and everything in it had already been measured and accepted. She reached for a loaner uniform, tying the belt with quiet precision, her fingers moving in a way that was almost too exact for someone new, but no one noticed, or if they did, they didn't understand what they were seeing. "Let's give her a proper welcome," Brad added, turning slightly to Jason, a faint smile forming, the kind that suggested a lesson was about to be taught, though not the one he thought. The room leaned in without realizing it, anticipation building in small glances, in half-suppressed grins, in the subtle shift of bodies turning toward the center, and Emily stood there, calm, composed, her eyes steady, not challenging, not intimidated, just present. Jason stepped forward, rolling his shoulders, his confidence effortless, the kind that came from never having been truly tested in a way that mattered. And as he approached her, the last bits of laughter faded into a quieter expectation, the kind that fills a room right before something changes. Emily met his gaze briefly, then looked past him, as if seeing something no one else could, and in that moment, there was a stillness that didn't belong to a beginner, a silence that hinted at something already decided. Somewhere in the back, a student lifted a phone, ready to capture what they thought would be a harmless moment, a quick demonstration, a reminder of hierarchy, but they had no idea they were about to record something entirely different. And as the clock on the wall ticked forward, unnoticed by most, the room unknowingly stepped into the final seconds before everything they believed about her would collapse into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Not Jason, not the students, not even Brad Hoffman, whose authority had always filled the room without question, because what had just happened did not fit into any explanation they were used to. And when something cannot be explained, silence becomes the only response. Jason slowly pulled back, his expression no longer confident, no longer amused, but searching, as if replaying the last few seconds in his mind and finding nothing that made sense. No clear mistake, no obvious opening, only the unsettling realization that he had been guided somewhere he never intended to go. Emily Carter stepped back just as calmly as she had stepped forward, releasing control without hesitation, without lingering, without any need to prove that she could have done more, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her breathing unchanged, her presence returning to that quiet neutrality that had first walked through the door. A student near the wall lowered his phone, the screen still recording, but his attention no longer on capturing a moment for entertainment. Now it was something else, something closer to witnessing, and the faint smile that had been on his face earlier had disappeared completely. Brad finally unfolded his arms, the movement slow, deliberate, but lacking the certainty it once carried, and he stepped forward onto the mat, his eyes fixed on Emily with a level of focus that had not been there before, as if he was now seeing her for the first time, not as a beginner, not as an outsider, but as a variable he had failed to calculate. "Where did you train?" he asked, his voice steady but noticeably lower, stripped of its earlier edge, and the room leaned in again, not with amusement this time, but with genuine curiosity, the kind that replaces judgment when certainty collapses. Emily did not answer immediately, and in that pause, something shifted again, because silence from someone like her no longer felt empty. It felt intentional, measured, as if every word she chose to speak would matter more than anything that had already been said. "I have moved around," she replied simply, her tone even, offering nothing more than what was necessary, and that answer, rather than satisfying the question, only deepened it, because it left too much unsaid, too many possibilities that the room could not easily define. Jason exhaled slowly, still processing, and took a step back toward the edge of the mat, no longer trying to reclaim the moment, no longer attempting to reassert anything, because whatever hierarchy had existed before had already been rewritten, not through force, not through dominance, but through something far more unsettling, precision without effort. One of the younger students, a teenager who had laughed earlier, shifted uncomfortably and glanced at his classmates, as if seeking confirmation that what he had just seen was real, but no one met his eyes, because each of them was dealing with the same realization in their own way, that they had judged too quickly, and now they had no language to undo it. Brad nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any praise he could have given, and he stepped aside, creating space not as a gesture of instruction, but as a quiet recognition that Emily no longer needed it. She walked toward the edge of the mat, her movements unchanged, still calm, still deliberate, as if nothing in her world had shifted at all, and that contrast between the storm of realization in the room and her complete composure made the moment even more profound. As she reached for her shoes, the same ones that had been quietly set aside when she entered, a student finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is she a competitor?" But the question lingered unanswered, not because no one knew, but because no one was certain they were ready to hear it. Brad watched her closely, his mind working through possibilities, recalling faces, tournaments, names, searching for something familiar, something that could restore a sense of understanding. But the harder he looked, the more he realized that whatever answer he was searching for would not change what had already been revealed. Emily slipped her shoes back on, tied them with the same quiet precision, and as she stood, she glanced once across the room, not at any specific person, but at the space itself, as if acknowledging it in a way that required no words, and then she turned toward the door. No one stopped her, no one called out, because in that moment, they understood something they had not understood before. That respect does not come from being announced, it comes from being undeniable, and the room, still wrapped in that heavy silence, held on to that realization long after she reached the exit, the sound of the door closing softly behind her echoing far louder than any laughter that had come before. The door had barely settled back into place when the room seemed to exhale all at once, a quiet release of tension that no one openly acknowledged, yet everyone felt, and for a few seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant noise of traffic outside, as if the world beyond those walls continued normally, while something inside had shifted in a way none of them were prepared to define. Jason Miller remained near the edge of the mat, his hands resting on his hips, his gaze fixed on the spot where Emily had stood just moments before, replaying the sequence again and again in his mind, searching not for excuses, but for understanding, because what unsettled him most was not that he had been outperformed, but that he had not even recognized it happening until it was already over. Across the room, the students began to move again, but slower, more deliberate, their earlier energy replaced by a kind of cautious awareness, as if every assumption they had carried into the space now felt unreliable, and a few exchanged glances, not with humor this time, but with questions they were not yet ready to voice. Brad Hoffman stood in the center, silent, his posture no longer rigid, his arms no longer crossed, and for the first time since the class had begun, he did not immediately take control of the room, because control required certainty, and certainty had just been challenged in front of everyone. "Line up," he finally said, his voice steady but quieter than before, and the students obeyed, though the rhythm of their movement lacked the sharpness it once had, each person more aware of the space, of each other, of the possibility that what they thought they understood about skill and hierarchy might not be as simple as they believed. The class resumed, drills continuing, instructions given, but something fundamental had changed, and it showed in small ways, in the hesitation before each movement, in the increased attention to detail, in the absence of casual laughter that had filled the room earlier. Jason partnered with another advanced student, but his focus was different now, less about proving, more about observing, as if he was trying to recalibrate his understanding of what mastery actually looked like. And every time he made a move, there was a fraction of a second where he questioned it, wondering how it might be seen, how it might be countered, how it might fail. On the far side of the room, the younger students practiced quietly, their earlier confidence replaced by a more careful approach, their eyes occasionally drifting toward Brad, as if waiting for him to explain what had happened, to restore the order they were used to, but no explanation came. Brad moved through the room, correcting positions, adjusting stances, offering guidance. But his usual commentary was restrained, his tone measured, and beneath it all, there was a subtle shift in his attention, a quiet acknowledgement that something had entered his academy that he had not anticipated. During a short break, the murmurs finally began, low voices exchanging fragments of speculation. "Did you see how fast that was?" one student whispered, while another shook his head. "It was not even about speed." And a third added, "It was like she already knew what he was going to do." And each comment carried a mix of disbelief and respect, the kind that forms when certainty gives way to realization. Jason sat on the edge of the mat, a water bottle in his hand, but he had not taken a sip, his mind still working through the details, and when one of his teammates approached and asked, "Who was she?" he did not answer right away, because, for the first time, he did not have an immediate response, and that alone was enough to unsettle him. Brad stood near the entrance, his eyes occasionally shifting toward the door, as if expecting it to open again, as if part of him knew that the story was not finished, that people like Emily Carter did not simply appear without reason, and the longer he stood there, the more he understood that whatever had happened in those 14 seconds was not a coincidence, not luck, not a fluke, but something far more deliberate. When the class ended, the students gathered their belongings in near silence, the usual chatter replaced by thoughtful quiet, and as they stepped out into the evening air, each carried a slightly different version of the same realization, that skill was not always visible, that confidence could be misleading, and that the most dangerous assumptions were the ones made too quickly. Inside the academy, Brad remained alone for a moment longer, standing on the mat where everything had unfolded, the polished surface reflecting the overhead lights, unchanged in appearance, yet marked by something intangible, something that could not be erased or explained away. And as he finally turned off the lights and headed toward the door, one thought lingered in his mind with quiet clarity. That respect is not something you give based on what you see. It is something you learn when what you see is proven wrong. The next morning arrived with a quiet weight that none of them could quite shake, even as the routines of their lives tried to pull them back into familiarity, because moments like the one they had witnessed do not fade easily. They settle, they linger, They reshape the way things are seen long after they are over. Jason Miller woke earlier than usual, the memory already waiting for him before his feet even touched the floor, and as he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at nothing in particular, he replayed it again, not the outcome, but the feeling, the subtle shift he had sensed just before everything changed, and for the first time in years, he questioned something deeper than technique. He questioned his understanding of control itself. At the academy, Brad Hoffman arrived before anyone else, unlocking the door and stepping into the stillness of the empty space. The mats untouched, the air quiet, and he stood there for a moment longer than usual, taking in the room not as a place he commanded, but as a place that had revealed something beyond him. He walked slowly across the mat, stopping at the exact spot where Emily had stood, his eyes scanning the space as if it might offer answers in its silence. But all it offered was the same quiet certainty that what had happened was real, and that it had not been an accident. By the time the first students arrived, there was already a different energy in the air, subtle but unmistakable, the usual greetings softer, the usual confidence tempered, and as Jason stepped through the door, their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, not of defeat, but of awareness. "Morning," Jason said, his voice steady, but lacking the casual ease it once carried, and Brad nodded in return, his expression thoughtful, as if measuring something that could not be easily defined. The class began as it always did, warm-ups, drills, repetition, but every movement carried a heightened attention, as if each student was now aware that there were layers they had not yet seen, and that awareness made them sharper, quieter, more deliberate. During a break, one of the younger students approached Jason cautiously, his voice low. "Do you think she is coming back?" And Jason paused before answering, not because he did not want to respond, but because he genuinely did not know, and that uncertainty felt unfamiliar. "I do not know," he said finally, and the honesty in his answer carried more weight than any confident assumption could have. Across the room, Brad watched them, his thoughts moving beyond the surface, beyond the immediate, towards something that had been building quietly since the moment Emily walked in, and without saying anything, he stepped toward the front desk, pulling up the sign-in records from the previous day. The name was there, simple, unremarkable at first glance, Emily Carter, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, and for a moment, it meant nothing, just another name among many, but something about it held his attention longer than it should have. He reached for his phone, hesitated briefly, then typed it in, not expecting much, just a curiosity he needed to satisfy. But as the results appeared, his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to still his movement completely. The screen showed a series of competition listings, articles, archived footage, and the more he scrolled, the clearer it became that what had happened in that room was only a fraction of a much larger story, one that none of them had been aware of, one that reframed everything they thought they had witnessed. Multiple titles, national level, international recognition, years of experience that had never been mentioned, never displayed, never used to announce her presence, and Brad exhaled slowly, lowering the phone just slightly, as the weight of that realization settled in. Jason noticed the shift immediately and stepped closer, his curiosity overriding hesitation. "What is it?" he asked, and Brad turned the screen toward him without a word. Jason's eyes moved across the information, his expression tightening, not in disbelief this time, but in recognition, as the pieces finally aligned, as the precision he had felt now had context, history, meaning. Around them, the room continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that the understanding of what had happened was now deepening, moving from confusion into clarity, and as Jason handed the phone back, he let out a breath he had been holding since the day before. "That explains it," he said quietly, and Brad nodded once, his gaze steady, not on the screen anymore, but on the space where Emily had stood, as if seeing it differently now, not as a moment that challenged his authority, but as a moment that revealed something he needed to learn. And somewhere beneath that realization, one thought settled with quiet certainty, that the most powerful presence in any room is often the one that never needs to announce itself. By the third day, the story had already spread beyond the walls of Iron Core Jiu-Jitsu Academy, not through loud announcements or deliberate sharing, but through quiet conversations. Fragments of disbelief carried from one person to another, each retelling slightly different, yet all pointing back to the same undeniable moment that had shifted something fundamental in everyone who had seen it. Students who had not even been present began arriving with a different kind of curiosity, their eyes scanning the room as if expecting to feel the echo of what had happened. And even those who had witnessed it firsthand carried themselves with a new awareness, their movements more intentional, their assumptions more restrained. Jason Miller stood near the mat, stretching slowly, his focus sharper than it had ever been, not because he felt the need to prove anything, but because he understood now that there were levels he had not yet reached, layers he had not yet seen, and that realization did not weaken him. It grounded him in a way he had never experienced before. Brad Hoffman, meanwhile, had spent the last 2 days observing more than instructing, watching his students with a quieter intensity, correcting less with authority and more with precision, as if he too had adjusted something internal that could not be easily explained. And though he had not spoken openly about what he had discovered, the shift in his approach was impossible to miss. Midway through the session, the door opened again, softly, almost unnoticed at first, and a few heads turned instinctively, not because they expected anything, but because something in the room had changed enough that every new presence now carried weight. Emily Carter stepped inside once more, dressed the same, calm, unassuming, her presence no louder than it had been before. Yet this time, there was no laughter, no smirks, no quick judgments passed between glances, only a quiet, collective awareness that moved through the room like a ripple. Jason saw her first and straightened slightly, not out of tension, but out of respect, and Brad turned a moment later, his gaze meeting hers with something entirely different from before, not curiosity, not doubt, but recognition. No one spoke right away, and that silence was not empty. It was deliberate, as if the room itself understood that whatever happened next needed no commentary. Emily walked to the edge of the mat, removed her shoes, and stepped forward with the same quiet precision, her movements unchanged, her demeanor steady, and for a moment, it felt as though time had folded back on itself, returning to the beginning, yet everything was different now. Brad approached her slowly, his posture relaxed but attentive, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the earlier condescension, only clarity. "You are welcome here," he said simply, and the words landed differently than they would have before, because they were no longer about permission, they were about acknowledgement. Emily nodded once, a small, respectful gesture, and moved into position without hesitation, without ceremony, as if she had never left. The class resumed, but the energy was transformed, every student more focused, more aware, and when drills began, there was a noticeable shift in how they engaged with one another, less about dominance, more about understanding, less about showing, more about learning. Jason partnered with Emily this time, not as a challenge, not as a test, but as an opportunity, and as they began, there was no audience leaning in for spectacle, only a quiet room observing with genuine attention. Their movements were controlled, measured, each exchange carrying a level of clarity that had not existed before, and Jason found himself learning in ways he had not expected, not through correction, not through instruction, but through presence, through the subtle adjustments that Emily made without needing to explain them. Across the room, Brad watched closely, not with authority, but with respect, recognizing that leadership was not about knowing everything, but about being willing to see when something greater appeared in front of you. The class continued, steady, focused, and when it ended, there was no need for discussion, no need for explanation, because everyone in that room had felt the shift for themselves, had understood it in their own way. As Emily stepped off the mat once more, she paused briefly, looking across the room with the same calm expression, and though she said nothing, the message was clear in the silence she left behind, that respect is not demanded, it is revealed, and once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. In the days that followed, something subtle but undeniable began to take root inside Iron Core Jiu-Jitsu Academy, not as a rule, not as a spoken lesson, but as a quiet shift in how people carried themselves, how they observed, how they judged, and most of all, how they approached the unknown. Emily Carter did not become the center of attention. She did not suddenly dominate conversations or claim any space beyond what she had always occupied. Yet her presence changed the atmosphere simply by existing within it, like a constant reminder that what you see is rarely the full story. Jason Miller found himself arriving earlier each day, not out of obligation, but out of a new kind of hunger, one that was no longer satisfied by winning or being recognized, but by understanding, and he began to notice details he had overlooked before: the angle of a stance, the timing of a breath, the way balance could be shifted with the smallest adjustment. One afternoon, as the class moved through a series of controlled drills, Jason paused mid-motion, his brow tightening slightly as he reconsidered something he had always done automatically. And without thinking, he glanced toward Emily, who was practicing quietly across the mat, her movements fluid, precise, almost effortless, and in that moment, he realized that what separated her was not strength or speed, but awareness, a level of clarity that removed hesitation entirely. Brad Hoffman watched all of this unfold with a perspective that had deepened since that first day, and though he still led the class, still corrected, still guided, there was a new humility in his approach, not weakness, but openness, a recognition that mastery was not a fixed position, but a continuous process of learning, even for someone in his role. During a brief pause between rounds, one of the newer students, a young man who had joined just that week, approached Brad with a quiet question. "How long does it take to get that good?" And Brad considered the question longer than he normally would have, his eyes briefly shifting toward Emily before returning to the student. "It takes as long as it takes for you to stop assuming you know what you are looking at," he replied, his voice calm, and the answer lingered in the air, heavier than expected, because it was not just about skill, it was about perspective. Across the room, Emily finished her drill and stepped aside, taking a moment to observe, her gaze moving across the students with quiet attentiveness, not judgmental, not distant, but engaged in a way that suggested she saw each person not for where they were, but for where they could go, and that kind of vision carried a weight that words could not easily match. Jason approached her after the session, his posture respectful, his tone steady. "I have been thinking about that day," he said, not as a confession, but as an acknowledgement, and Emily looked at him with the same calm expression, waiting, allowing him the space to continue. "I did not even realize what was happening until it was already over," he admitted, and there was no embarrassment in his voice, only honesty, and that honesty marked a shift greater than any physical skill he had developed before. Emily nodded slightly, her response simple but precise. "That is because you were trying to control everything," she said, and Jason frowned just a bit, not in disagreement, but in realization. "Then what should I have been doing?" he asked, and for a moment, Emily did not answer, her gaze steady, as if measuring the question itself. "You should have been paying attention," she replied finally, and the simplicity of it carried more depth than any complex explanation could have offered. Jason absorbed the words quietly, nodding once, and as he stepped back, there was a subtle shift in his posture, not dramatic, but real, the kind of change that begins internally and slowly reshapes everything else. Around them, the academy continued its rhythm, students training, learning, adjusting, but beneath it all, something had evolved, a deeper respect, a quieter focus, a shared understanding that mastery was not about being seen, but about seeing clearly. And as Emily gathered her things once more, preparing to leave as quietly as she had arrived, no one laughed, no one questioned, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through words, not through force, but through a presence that spoke louder than either ever could. And in that room, where certainty had once ruled, there was now something far more valuable: awareness. Weeks passed, and what had once been a single unexpected moment had quietly transformed into something far more enduring, something that no longer belonged to just one day or one exchange, but had woven itself into the culture of Iron Core Jiu-Jitsu Academy in ways that could not be easily undone. The laughter that had once come so easily in moments of judgment had disappeared entirely, replaced by a kind of quiet respect that showed itself not in words, but in behavior, in the way students approached each other, in the way they listened, in the way they paused before assuming anything at all. Emily Carter remained exactly as she had always been, consistent, composed, never seeking attention, never correcting anyone unless asked. Yet her influence extended far beyond her actions, because what she had revealed had forced everyone else to confront something within themselves. Jason Miller had changed the most visibly, though even his transformation was subtle, marked not by dramatic gestures, but by restraint, by patience, by a willingness to slow down and truly observe before acting. And during one session, as he worked through a sequence with a newer student, he stopped mid-movement and adjusted his approach, not to demonstrate superiority, but to guide, to share understanding. And the student looked at him with a kind of surprise that mirrored the realization Jason himself had experienced not long before. Brad Hoffman, standing nearby, noticed the exchange and allowed a small nod to pass, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that something meaningful had taken hold, something that no longer required enforcement or instruction, because it had been learned through experience. One evening, as the sun dipped low outside the tall windows and cast long golden reflections across the mat, the class gathered for a final round of practice, the room filled with a focused quiet that had become its new normal, and Emily moved through the space with the same steady rhythm, her presence now understood without explanation. A visitor stood near the entrance, watching with interest, a man who had come to observe the academy after hearing about its growing reputation, and as he scanned the room, his eyes settled briefly on Emily, noting her calm demeanor, her understated appearance, and without thinking, he leaned slightly toward Brad and said in a low voice, "She looks like a beginner." And for a brief moment, the words hung in the air, familiar, echoing something that had once been said before. Brad turned slowly, his expression composed, and there was no irritation in his response, no need to correct harshly, only clarity shaped by experience. "She does," he replied simply, and then paused just long enough for the meaning to settle before adding, "That is why you should look again." The visitor frowned slightly, not yet understanding, but as he continued to watch, his expression began to shift, the same way it had for everyone else who had witnessed her before, from assumption to curiosity, from curiosity to recognition, and finally into that quiet, unmistakable silence that follows true understanding. Across the mat, Jason moved with a level of awareness that had not been there weeks ago. His movements no longer rushed, no longer driven by the need to dominate, but guided by clarity. And as he completed a sequence, he glanced briefly toward Emily, not seeking validation, but acknowledging the source of what had changed within him. Emily met his gaze for just a moment, a small nod passing between them, nothing dramatic, nothing spoken, yet everything understood. As the session came to an end, the students gathered their belongings, the room returning to its usual stillness. But it was a different kind of stillness now, one filled not with uncertainty, but with quiet confidence rooted in awareness. The visitor lingered a moment longer, watching Emily as she stepped off the mat, her movements unchanged, her presence as understated as ever, and he shook his head slightly, a faint smile forming as realization settled in. "I almost missed it," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, and Brad, standing nearby, allowed a small, knowing glance in response. Emily slipped on her shoes, tying them with the same careful precision, and as she walked toward the door, there was no need for acknowledgement, no need for applause, because the lesson she had brought into that room had already taken root in every person who had been willing to see it. And as the door closed softly behind her once again, the room did not return to what it had been before, because once awareness replaces assumption, there is no going back, only forward, with clearer eyes and a deeper understanding of what true mastery looks like. Time moved forward, as it always does, but inside Iron Core Jiu-Jitsu Academy, something permanent had been left behind, something that did not fade with days or weeks, something that quietly reshaped the way every person who stepped onto that mat saw the world around them. The story of that moment was no longer told with excitement or exaggeration. It was told with a kind of calm certainty, as if everyone understood that what had happened was not extraordinary because of what was done, but because of what it revealed. New students continued to arrive, each one carrying their own assumptions, their own quiet judgments formed long before they ever stepped through the door. But now, those assumptions did not last long, because the culture they entered no longer allowed them to go unchallenged. On one particular evening, as the light outside softened into a warm glow and the academy settled into its steady rhythm, A new group of beginners lined up along the edge of the mat, their eyes scanning the room, measuring, comparing, deciding who seemed experienced and who did not. Among them stood a young woman, quiet, unassuming, her posture relaxed, her presence easy to overlook, and for a brief moment, a few of the newer students exchanged glances, the same kind of glances that had once filled this room before everything changed. But before anything could be said, before any laughter could take shape, Jason Miller stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Watch first," he said simply, and the tone in his voice carried enough weight to stop the moment before it could unfold. The students fell silent, not out of fear, but out of curiosity, and as they turned their attention back to the mat, they began to see differently, not looking for weakness, not searching for easy comparisons, but observing with a kind of openness that had not existed there before. Brad Hoffman stood at the center, his presence steady, no longer defined by authority alone, but by something deeper, something shaped by the understanding that leadership is not about being above others, but about recognizing what stands in front of you, even when it does not look the way you expect. And then there was Emily Carter, still moving through the space with the same quiet consistency, her actions unchanged, her demeanor steady, never seeking to teach, yet always teaching, never asking to be noticed, yet impossible to overlook once you truly saw her. That evening, as the class progressed, one of the new students hesitated during a drill, uncertain, unsure of what to do next, and without making a scene, without drawing attention, Emily stepped closer, offering a small adjustment, a subtle correction, her voice calm, her guidance precise, and the student nodded, not fully understanding everything yet, but feeling the clarity in what was being shown. Across the room, Jason watched the interaction and allowed himself a faint smile, not because he found it surprising anymore, but because he recognized it, the same quiet precision, the same effortless understanding that had changed him from the inside out. When the session came to an end, the students gathered their things, the room settling into that familiar silence that had replaced the noise of earlier days. And as they stepped out into the night, there was no need for anyone to explain what had been learned, because it had already taken hold in the way they moved, the way they thought, the way they saw each other. Emily slipped on her shoes once more, tying them with the same careful attention, and as she stood, she paused for just a moment, her gaze moving across the room, taking in the space that had once underestimated her, now transformed into something entirely different. She did not smile, she did not speak, because she did not need to, and as she turned and walked toward the door, the room remained still, not out of shock, not out of confusion, but out of understanding. And as the door closed softly behind her, the lesson she left behind remained, not written on the walls, not spoken aloud, but carried quietly within every person who had been willing to see it, that the most powerful truths do not announce themselves, they reveal themselves, and once they do, the world is never quite the same again. In this powerful journey of dignity and perception, a quiet woman walks into a jiu-jitsu class and is instantly judged, while an experienced instructor allows the moment to unfold, unaware of what is about to be revealed. Through a sequence that unfolds in seconds yet echoes far beyond, this story captures the essence of touching stories where silence speaks louder than pride, as the room shifts from laughter to stillness. The transformation of a confident fighter and the awakening of a respected instructor highlight why touching stories resonate so deeply with audiences seeking meaning and justice. This narrative continues to explore how presence, humility, and unseen mastery redefine respect, making it one of those unforgettable touching stories that challenge assumptions and elevate human awareness, with every moment grounded in realism and emotional depth. This is among the most compelling touching stories that remind us that true strength is quiet, and in the end, it stands as one of those rare touching stories where the greatest lesson is not taught, but revealed.